xProfessor here from Rounding Some Corners, also on TikTok. I'd like to ask you if you could picture what a pile of 40,000 bricks looks like. 40,000 bricks, can you see it in your mind? No, you can't, because the number's too big and it's too abstract. And that's what makes that number so tragic when we are talking about 40,000 human beings who you can't see because the number's too big, 40,000 human beings who are incarcerated in prisons in the United States for marijuana-related offenses. And of those 40,000, they are disproportionately brown and black people. And so that's what we're taking on today in this installment of our video lecture series called Marijuana as Doxa. We are taking on marijuana racism as Doxa. Marijuana racism as Doxa because marijuana does have a long history of racism. And we're going to break that down today. Remember, Doxa is an area of knowledge that gets constructed over time by various institutions of society, sometimes over decades, and ends up in a place where it's unexamined. The assumptions behind the knowledge that's in that Doxa are not criticized, they're not critically examined, and the Doxa goes on in perpetuity. It just continues on with the belief system. The Doxa of marijuana has been that it is a dangerous drug, which it is not. And that dangerous drug Doxa is what we are taking apart in this video lecture series, and today's installment has to do with marijuana racism. There is no person who is more widely associated with racist policy in the United States than Harry Anslinger. Do you know Harry Anslinger? Harry Anslinger was the chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 all the way to 1962. That's 32 years. He was in that position of power. And he was a racist, which we're going to show a little bit later. Having that person in that position of power guiding marijuana policy for 32 years is something that we are still trying to crawl out from under. The war on drugs is known as being originated by Harry Anslinger because that's what he took on in 1930. The war on drugs that we're still trying to get out from under today in the 2000s was born by Harry Anslinger because he took it upon himself and his agency to rid the United States of all drugs, cocaine, heroin, and he put marijuana falsely into that same category. So that was his goal, to rid the United States of drugs. He was a supporter of prohibition, just like prohibition existed for alcohol, making it illegal. He wanted the same for drugs. And he had a particular sore spot for marijuana because of his racism. So he pursued that sore spot in two ways. One was he used the word marijuana. Now, marijuana is a word that we're trying to rehabilitate on Rounding Some Corners, as are other people's, being the appropriate word for that substance. But in 1930, the most common term that was used for marijuana was cannabis, the Latin term to describe the plant. Harry Anslinger, however, knew that by using the word marijuana, American people, I shouldn't say American because Mexicans are American people and so are Canadians, we're all part of North America, but U.S. people, some U.S. people, the ones who had xenophobic tendencies, which is being afraid of or being prejudiced against people from another country just because they're from another country, he knew that there was a xenophobia in Americans that he could trigger by associating marijuana with Mexicans. Marijuana was a term that was popularized by the Spanish when they colonized Mexico, and Mexicans preferred that term. They spelled it with an H in the middle, and then when it got anglicized by the English language, it picked up the J instead of the H. But that term, Harry Anslinger knew, would conjure up images of crazy Mexicans, of violent Mexicans, of Mexicans seeking to immigrate. Now, when you talk to a lot of Mexicans, by the way, they have a completely different view of immigration because they view ancient ancestral lands as far as Wisconsin and Colorado, where indigenous Mexican peoples lived before the Mexican-American War that set the border between Mexico and America. Mexican peoples, they say we never left Mexico, even though you put the border down here. Now, we never left the United States, even though you put the border down here. We're always in the United States. It's part of our ancestral land. So Harry Anslinger knew that there would be a deep-seated fear amongst a lot of Americans who would be afraid of invasions and the kinds of people that they thought Mexicans were by associating marijuana with Mexicans. And he did this through press releases. His office would put out crime reports, and the crime reports would often have hemp or marijuana in the description associating the crime, which would be a violent crime usually, along with the drug. And he started to do that in a way that would get people to think of the violent criminals as being Mexican, and those Mexican people using marijuana and spreading that to American people. But that was not the only group that Harry Anslinger went after. He also went after black people. And he did this first by targeting black musicians, jazz musicians. Most jazz musicians were black, and many black jazz musicians preferred marijuana to alcohol because alcohol would numb their fingers if they were playing instruments or screw up their voices, so they preferred the effects of marijuana, and they used marijuana more predominantly. Harry Anslinger was very aware of this, and he started to go after jazz musicians to try to demagogue them. And one in particular, Billie Holiday, a female jazz musician, was said to be pursued by people that were hired by his agency, the DEA as it is today, but back then the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger, to try and demonize her and portray her as a person who was sick and twisted and other kinds of unseemly terms that would go along with how he thought marijuana users should be portrayed. Billie Holiday died tragically from an overdose, and her final years were spent suffering from the perceived pursuit from this agency. But Harry Anslinger didn't stop there. He also put out news reports of crimes talking about black people and talking about them in the most unseemly ways associated with marijuana. Here's an example of a press release from his office. 2 Negroes took a girl, 14 years old, and kept her for 2 days under the influence of hemp. Upon recovery, she was found to be suffering from syphilis. Could you embed 2 sentences with more derogatory and poisonous terms than to talk about Negroes, number one, talk about a girl who's underage, 14, talk about hemp, and talk about a sexually transmitted disease? These are the kinds of imagery, presuppositions that were put out by the office consistently for years, for 32 years. And it has resulted in policies that have disproportionately put black people in jail for marijuana offenses. And that's why you have a project called the Last Prisoner Project. The Last Prisoner Project, so appropriately named, standing on principle that it will not rest until the very last prisoner has been released who has been incarcerated for marijuana. Because predominantly the people who are in jail are African Americans, are black people and brown people as well. And it's not enough just to recognize that so many more people are in jail from different races than white people. They need to be released. We need to have criminal justice reform, which the discussion, thankfully, is taking place at the federal level, but it's still slow moving, and we still have states that are not moving fast enough to release these prisoners and grant them amnesty. And just if you're wondering, by the way, whether black people use marijuana more than white people, it's not true. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Law, also known as NORML, which is against the prohibition of marijuana, that's what they referred to the current policy towards marijuana. It's prohibited, just like alcohol was. NORML states that African Americans use marijuana about as often as white people. And so there is no disparate use. Therefore, there can only be racist policies that have led to 4 times as many African Americans being put in prison as white people. I can tell you that the legacy of Harry Anslinger lived all the way up through the 1970s, because in the 1970s in high school, when we were trying to chase down marijuana, which was not that easy to find sometimes, we would be disappointed if we got Mexican weed. Mexican weed was known as dusty, dirty, seedy. It broke apart in your hands. It was really just one cut above homegrown. And then the buzz that you would get from it was barely there at all. But still you were glad to have it. But that didn't stop us from perpetuating the myth that this is Mexican weed, that this is weed that is of a lesser quality, just like Mexican people were portrayed through marijuana's racist policies by Harry Anslinger's agencies. And so we've still got a long way to go before we get out from underneath that big, heavy, and ugly rock of racism that has been sitting on top of marijuana as Doxa as a dangerous drug. We're talking about marijuana racism as Doxa.